While Columbus was getting lost looking for India, the richest man in human history was running a trade empire that stretched across 3 continents. His name was Mansa Musa, and what Africans were doing in 1492 will completely change how you see world history. I'm talking about civilization so advanced that they make medieval Europe look like it was stuck in the Stone Age. But here's what's crazy. There's one African civilization that was so advanced in 1492, they were performing brain surgery while Europeans were still bloodletting. Can you guess which one? I'll reveal the answer in exactly 7 minutes, but first let me blow your mind with what was really happening across the African continent while Columbus was fumbling around the Caribbean. Picture this, it's 1492, and while Columbus is literally begging Queen Isabella for 3 tiny ships and a handful of desperate sailors, there's a man in West Africa whose grandfather once carried so much gold on a pilgrimage that he crashed the entire Egyptian economy for a decade. This is Mansa Musa's descendant ruling the Mali Empire, and we're not talking about some primitive kingdom here. We're talking about a civilization that controlled 40% of the world's gold supply, where the city of Timbuktu had 25,000 university students studying mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and where trade routes connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean in a network so sophisticated it would make Amazon jealous. The Mali Empire wasn't just rich, it was intellectually dominant. While European scholars were copying ancient Greek texts, African scholars in Timbuktu were writing original works on everything from Islamic jurisprudence to astronomical calculations. The University of Sankore had professors who corresponded with scholars in Cairo, Baghdad, and Mecca. These weren't just religious schools, they were centers of learning where students came from across the Islamic world to study under African masters. Wait, pause. Did you know that in 1492, the city of Timbuktu had more books than all of Europe combined? That's not a typo. More books than all of Europe. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from mathematics to poetry, from astronomy to medicine. And these weren't just copied texts, these were original African works that were being traded across the Sahara like precious commodities. But Mali wasn't the only power player. Let me take you 2,000 miles south to something that will completely shatter your assumptions about medieval Africa. There's a kingdom called Great Zimbabwe that was building massive stone cities without using a single drop of mortar. These weren't mud huts. These were sophisticated urban centers with walls 36 feet high and 20 feet thick, built from granite blocks fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a knife between them. The Great Zimbabwe ruins you might have heard of? They were the New York City of 1492 Africa. This empire housed 18,000 people in its capital alone, controlled the gold and ivory trade routes to Asia, and had established trade relationships with merchants from India, Persia, and China. Archaeological evidence shows they were importing Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Indian cloth while exporting African gold and ivory across the Indian Ocean. Hold up, let me show you something that'll blow your mind. When Great Zimbabwe was at its peak, it was larger and more sophisticated than most medieval European cities. We're talking about organized districts, specialized craftsmen, advanced metallurgy, and international trade networks that reached as far as Indonesia. The city had a complex water management system, terraced agriculture, and social stratification that supported a population larger than London at the time. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe wasn't just impressive architecturally, it was economically dominant. They controlled the goldfields of the Zimbabwe Plateau and had established mining operations that were so efficient they were supplying gold to the Indian Ocean trade network for over 400 years. When Portuguese explorers finally reached the East African coast in the early 1500s, they found Zimbabwean gold in the hands of Arab and Indian merchants who had been trading with African kingdoms for centuries. But here's where it gets really interesting. While Columbus was struggling to convince people that the world was round, African navigators were already using sophisticated astronomical knowledge to navigate the Indian Ocean. The Swahili city-states along the East African coast weren't just coastal villages, they were full-blown maritime empires with fleets that regularly sailed to India, Persia, and China. Cities like Kilwa, Mogadishu, and Malindi were cosmopolitan centers where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants conducted business in multiple languages. Kilwa minted its own currency that was accepted from Somalia to Mozambique. Their ships, called dhows, were designed specifically for long-distance ocean travel and could carry tons of cargo across the Indian Ocean using monsoon wind patterns that African sailors had mastered for centuries. Quick reality check: some African cities in 1492 had better sanitation systems than London would have for another 300 years. Kilwa had running water, public baths, and sewage systems while European cities were still dumping waste in the streets. The level of urban planning in these Swahili cities was so advanced that when Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived in 1498, he described them as rivaling the finest cities in Europe. Now let me take you to the Horn of Africa, where something absolutely mind-blowing was happening. The Ethiopian Empire in 1492 wasn't just surviving, it was thriving as one of the most advanced civilizations civilizations in the world. They had been a Christian kingdom for over 1,000 years, had developed their own unique script called GEZ, and had established trade relationships with both the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean network. But here's the kicker: Ethiopian physicians were performing cataract surgery, trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure, and other medical procedures that European doctors wouldn't master for centuries. They had written medical texts, established hospitals, and developed pharmaceutical knowledge that drew from both African traditional medicine and Islamic medical science. Remember that brain surgery question from the beginning? It was Ethiopia. Ethiopian doctors were literally opening people's skulls and performing successful brain surgery, while European physicians were still convinced that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. They had surgical instruments, anesthetics made from local plants, and success rates that would be impressive even by modern standards. And that's not even the most shocking thing they were doing. The Ethiopian Empire claimed to possess the original Ark of the Covenant, and they built a series of churches that are so architecturally impossible they seem like they were designed by aliens. I'm talking about the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, 11 medieval churches carved directly into volcanic rock, going down into the earth instead of up into the sky. These aren't just impressive buildings, they're impossible buildings. Each church was carved from a single piece of solid rock, with internal chambers, windows, doors, and decorative elements all carved from the same volcanic stone. Some of these churches are 12 stories deep, with underground tunnels connecting them in a network that archaeologists are still mapping today. The Church of St. George in Lalibela is carved in the shape of a perfect Greek cross, cut 40 feet down into solid rock with walls that are perfectly vertical and floors that are perfectly level. The precision is so exact that modern engineers can't figure out how 12th century craftsmen achieved it with medieval tools. There are no construction joints, no added materials, it's literally one continuous piece of carved stone. But wait, there's one African achievement that's so advanced, archaeologists are still trying to figure out how they did it. The construction of these churches required not just incredible skill, but mathematical precision that suggests knowledge of advanced engineering principles. The drainage systems are so sophisticated that after 800 years, these underground churches still don't flood during Ethiopia's rainy season. Now let me blow your mind with what was happening in the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush. These civilizations in what is now Sudan were metallurgical masters who had been working with iron for over 2,000 years by 1492. They weren't just making tools, they were creating steel alloys that European blacksmiths couldn't replicate. The kingdom of Kush had been producing iron weapons and tools since 800 BCE, making them one of the earliest iron-working civilizations in the world. By 1492, Nubian metallurgists were creating steel that was stronger and more durable than anything being produced in Europe. They had developed smelting techniques that could reach temperatures European furnaces couldn't achieve, and they were using these techniques to create everything from weapons to agricultural tools to decorative items. Nubian archers were legendary across the ancient world. The Egyptians called Nubia the land of the bow because Nubian archery skills were so superior that Egyptian pharaohs hired Nubian soldiers as elite troops. By 1492, Nubian military technology included not just superior bows and arrows, but also advanced metallurgy for weapons, sophisticated fortification techniques, and military strategies that had been refined over centuries of warfare. But the Nubians weren't just warriors, they were engineers. They developed irrigation systems that supported millions of people in what is now one of the world's most arid regions. They built cities along the Nile that were centers of trade and learning. They created a written script, established diplomatic relationships with kingdoms across Africa and the Middle East, and maintained a sophisticated economy based on gold mining, ironworking, and long-distance trade. The irrigation systems they built were so advanced that they're still being studied by modern engineers. They used a combination of canals, dams, and reservoirs to distribute Nile water across hundreds of miles of desert, creating agricultural areas that could support large populations. Some of these irrigation systems were so well designed that they operated for over 1,000 years without major repairs. And that brings us to the truth that changes everything about 1492. While Columbus was fumbling around the Caribbean with 3 small ships and 90 men, completely lost and thinking he had reached Asia, the African continent was home to dozens of sophisticated civilizations that were operating on a truly global scale. The Mali Empire was conducting trade with North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Great Zimbabwe was connected to trade networks that reached China and Indonesia. The Swahili city-states were operating maritime routes that crisscrossed the Indian Ocean. Ethiopian merchants were trading with both the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean network. Nubian kingdoms were supplying gold and iron to civilizations across 3 continents. Here's what's really mind-blowing. When Columbus discovered the Americas, he was actually trying to find a sea route to the wealth of Asia because European merchants were tired of paying African and Middle Eastern middlemen for access to Asian goods. The spice trade, the silk trade, the gold trade, all of these were controlled by African African, Arab, and Indian merchants who had been running these networks for centuries. Columbus wasn't exploring, he was trying to cut African traders out of the global economy, and he failed miserably. While he was getting lost in the Caribbean, African merchants were continuing to operate trade networks that spanned 3 continents and generated wealth that European kingdoms could only dream of. The economic sophistication of these African civilizations was staggering. They had developed banking systems, credit mechanisms, insurance for long-distance trade, and currency systems that were accepted across vast geographic regions. Merchants in Timbuktu could write letters of credit that would be honored in Cairo, Mecca, or Baghdad. Traders in Kilwa could arrange financing for expeditions to India using financial instruments that were more sophisticated than anything available in Europe. But perhaps the most shocking truth is this: in 1492, Africa wasn't isolated from the world, Europe was. While European kingdoms were fighting endless wars over small territories, African civilizations were participating in a global economy that connected Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in networks of trade, cultural exchange, and technological innovation. The scientific achievements alone are staggering. African astronomers were making calculations that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. African physicians were performing medical procedures that European doctors couldn't imagine. African engineers were building structures that modern architects still can't fully understand. African metallurgists were creating alloys that European blacksmiths couldn't duplicate. And here's the kicker: all of this was happening while Europe was in what historians call the Dark Ages. While European literacy rates were in single digits, African cities had universities with thousands of students. While European cities were disease-ridden and unsanitary, African cities had running water and sewage systems. While European medicine was based on superstition and bloodletting, African physicians were performing surgery and developing pharmaceutical treatments. The question isn't what were Africans doing in 1492, it's why weren't we taught this in school? The answer is uncomfortable but simple. This version of history doesn't fit the narrative that European colonizers needed to justify their actions. It's hard to claim you are civilizing people who were already more advanced than you were. 1492 wasn't the year the world got connected, it was the year Europe finally joined a conversation that had been happening for centuries. Columbus didn't discover a new world, he stumbled into a world that was already connected by African, Arab, and Asian networks of trade, culture, and knowledge. The real story of 1492 is that while one lost Italian sailor was trying to find Asia and ended up in the Caribbean, the African continent was home to some of the most advanced civilizations in human history. They were performing brain surgery while Europeans were bloodletting. They were building architectural wonders while Europeans were living in wooden hovels. They were operating global trade networks while Europeans were fighting over villages. If this changed how you see history, smash that like button and subscribe for more hidden stories that will completely transform your understanding of the past. And comment below, what other historical myths do you want me to bust? Trust me, there are plenty more where this came from, and each one will blow your mind just as much as this one did.